Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for staying to the bitter end. Hopefully it won't be so bitter. So I wanted to first set the stage and really, Susie sort of was speaking for Future Earth in terms of where we are and what the vision is. And I want to really distinguish that from my talk. I am on the engagement committee, but I'm not giving a presentation of sort of the word of Future Earth per se, and I think that's an important distinction here. Instead, I'm speaking from sort of a world that I engage in terms of the intersection of science and technology and information and communication, as sort of a reflection, if you will, of building off of some of the things that Susie laid out in terms of this idea of co-production of knowledge. How does that vision intersect with the digital age? And as Susie was speaking, I wish I had now put back the image of co-production that is sort of the centerpiece of the engagement framework that we're building around. But this is also, I also had envisioned when I set up these slides, I thought we'd all be in a very cozy room, almost, holding hands, discussing about the next stage of research and engagement in the world. But obviously that's a very different setting, so bear with me. If I would rename my talk now, but this is the name of the talk I gave in my abstract, but I probably would use engagement rather than communication. The main point that I really want to focus on is, building on what Susie said, that Future Earth seeks to build and connect science to practice by promoting and strengthening the co-production of knowledge in global research programs. And, from my perspective, we're at a stage, I feel like we need to work with the community, both, and I mean the community broadly, society, researchers who are part of society, to define what role Future Earth can best play in doing that. And we've already had a lot of outreach in that, but I think we're still at that outreach stage. It's not only how, as a community, can we do that, can we do the co-production of knowledge, but what role can Future Earth play? And in that context, there's another question that I think is also important. What role does sort of the engagement process and the communication process, what role does the digital world play? And I want to present here a few perspectives on perhaps the opportunities and challenges for this engagement in science and communication of science and the co-production of knowledge in scientific research within the context of the digital age. So as I said, digital age creates great opportunities and challenges. To start off with some opportunities, there's an increasing decentralization of information, both in the access to information as well as in the collection of information. And this is really transforming how we do research, how we access the research, the information that's produced. It enables a greater dialogue between a much broader collection of actors. And that's, of course, could be hugely valuable in terms of who and how we're co-producing knowledge with. And it, of course, expands our reach in terms of the information that we can get and we can collect, both in temporal and in spatial scale. So these are huge things. And it makes us, in the process of this change of the digital age, it also is affecting our model of science communication and science engagement, bridging the tools we have for bridging the gap of science and action. Susie had a slightly different picture in terms of this pipe, but I think the image is very similar in terms of the traditional approach of sort of thinking about the link from science to action, or whether that be the general public or policy or resource managers, has often been within the frame of bridging bridging the gap and really thinking about a bridge. And in the context, there certainly has been a discussion of and an evolution of this two-way communication. And that two-way communication has often been talked about in the science policy community, of the need for these boundary organizations that have a foot in each world, a foot in the science world, a foot in the public policy world. I see Andy Gunther over there, who's with the Union of Concerned Scientists, an organization that both Susie and I used to work with, and that was, I really think of as a boundary organization that really has engaged in different, has researchers, but also, and understands the language of research, but also has a very strong footing in different sectors of society. But the world today is different, right? We're not, that linear model doesn't really represent the world. And I would say that the digital age has really helped make that change in terms of more of a network perspective. But unfortunately, the scientific community, I think, has not fit into this network as efficiently as possible. And I think that's reflective of this transition that perhaps we need to make to be more integrative in our research and sharing our knowledge, but also in the co-production of the knowledge. So really what we want to do is have a picture like this, where science is more integrated into society and more accessible and more smoothly co-produced. So how do we get there? Well, there's some challenges that I think that I guess the point there is that I think there are opportunities that would be a natural way for the digital world to make that transition, to help that transition. But I also think that there are challenges, and I'd say one of the challenges is sort of the institutional and cultural challenges within the research community to shift and change how science is done. And Susie mentioned this from a different perspective, but I think also in terms of the engagement with the digital world. And I would argue that may in fact be isolating us from the broader society. So to think about how has it been isolating us? Well, I want to go through briefly just to remind us this evolution of the communication and information communication technologies and put it in that framework. You know, many years ago we were in this communication world of one-to-one communication, you know, phone calls, coffee shops, and gradually that changed from one to many, more of a broadcast mode, whether it's TV or radio or newspapers, where you could have one story and get it to a lot of people. And eventually then that switched to one to many and many to one, and that's sort of the the blogs, the digital world where there's an exchange, but it's still from one person to the world or the other way around. But now we're switching to one among many, and that's the conversation mode. And I think that's the leap that the broader world has made very rapidly, and is actually even moving to many among many. And I think that transition is not one that the scientific community has moved as quickly along with. And there's this line, I think, that there's a hesitance to, and it's a real challenge for the scientific community, I think, to cross. And I think it, rightly so, to be honest. And that is, I think that the world to the left of this line is an expert world. It's an expert-driven world. It's a one to many, many to one. It's the one can be the expert, and there's a dependence on that. But I really think in the other side of the line, there's sort of a post-expert discussion, right? Everybody's voice can have equal airtime. How does the scientific community integrate the expert voice into the context of the fact that everybody can have equal airtime? And as Susie said, there are lots of other types of knowledge, but not about every single thing. Every knowledge isn't necessarily equal about every aspect. And so how do we engage in that world? It's so counter to, in some ways, the scientific structure. So the challenges to crossing this line are, the research community is a very closed community. You often have to have a PhD to be accepted, and the credibility that's found in there is the degrees and publications. But this isn't true in this many-to-many world, right? There's an insulated reward structure in the scientific community that is very different than the reward structure of the broader non-expert world, or post-expert world. And, you know, there's limited desire to probably cross that line, because as you know, Susie mentioned in another context, it does take time, and it takes time to make change. And, you know, is that time really worth the difference that it's going to make crossing that line? So now this isn't to say that scientists aren't engaged in the social web. There certainly is. There's an increasing amount of scientists. I took out the slide that had statistics in there just to streamline so we could have questions. But I think that, you know, certainly not at the scale of the broader world. But I think more importantly, it's not that whether the scientific community is engaged in this, it's rather the importance that there's really a divide, that there's not much connection, I think, between the overlap between that, the engagement in the scientific community in the digital age and digital world, and that of the broader public. And furthermore, the trends in the digital age may in fact be further isolating the science community rather than what one think is actually, even though it has the power of enabling more engagement. So what are some of these trends? Where, well, there's, you know, one thing, you know, that folks have called the daily me, where, you know, instead of reading more broadly information, we go online, we decide what we want, the information when we get, and this is the information we read every day, which really narrows our scope to those things that are important to us, and not necessarily enables a dialogue that goes outside of our small network and our smaller perspective of the world. Social networks, of course, as well. What our colleagues and what our friends, what our networks like, are the one where we increasingly get news. And even in search engines, you know, if I search something and the person in the back of the room searches something on their same computer, we are going to get different answers because of the fact that the search engine knows what we like, the differences in what we like. And so there's a filter bubble in the types of information we get. So all of these pieces together actually is enhancing strengthening this line between these two communities, even though the network is there, the structure is there for these tools to be actually more effective. So what this is doing is actually reinforcing a lot of the things that we actually see in the everyday world outside of the digital world. And that is, this is a comparison that shows sort of the increasing sorting of the populations in the US. And the comparison here is looking at landslides in elections, which shows that in 1976, the picture on the left shows in black and in gray all of those areas that were where the elections were run in a landslide, and in the white areas where they were much more competitive, compared to the 2004 election, where 2004 map, where you can see there's actually very much less white. In other words, there's much more division, much more clear political sorting of our perspectives. So this is just to say there's sort of a reinforcement of the online and offline world. And this is just a quick analysis that we did to look at what is the sorting, what's the representation of AGU members? AGU members particularly with a tag on their membership that has global environmental change. And you can see that, you know, not surprising, part of this is a little bit population, right? But most of those scientists with a global environmental change tag on their membership live in fairly liberal centers. In fact, the vast majority live in counties that voted for Obama, for example, as a measure of this disaggregation. Now, that's not to say that necessarily the people who live there, that's their political affiliation, but it does say that there is this disaggregation, that people don't interact with scientists as much as a result of this sort of sorting, if you will. So given these challenges and given the opportunities of the digital age, how, you know, first of all, is it productive? Is it useful to cross this line? And I would say yes, it is useful. There's a lot of opportunities to enhance and, if used appropriately, to expand and enrich the co-production of knowledge across scales and across sectors. But how to do it? Well, I talked earlier about the boundary organizations being the traditional way of thinking about bridging the gap of science and action. Well, I think we can think more extensively about boundary networks and what that looks like. How is that different than boundary organizations? I don't think that we've sort of expanded. I don't have an answer to this. I'm really, as I said, presenting this and was planning to present this more as a kickoff or a discussion as we learn about what role we can play in supporting and promoting co-production of knowledge in global research. But I do think that, thinking systematically about what are the ways that we can connect across these lines so that it becomes one network, and what are the mechanisms for doing that is important. And I think that, thinking about those mechanisms that link the formal and informal science, cross societal and social norms, prioritize process and learning rather than just products, will be important for this transition to using the power of the digital age in the co-production process. Now, we have citizen science, and I do think this is it's definitely a growing sector. I do think this can be a, boundary mechanism, if you will. In other words, a way of beginning to have discussions. I don't think this, in and of itself, creates a boundary network, but I do think there are tools and examples out there of how we can begin to think about doing things differently. And there's a model there that can be perhaps built on as tools for co-production. I think the perhaps more conducive to moving towards direct from mechanism to network would be the assessment process, which right now has been traditionally has been product from the scientific community released to society, although that has been changing certainly in the National Climate Assessment this last year, which Susie was a part of and many others may be in the room, certainly began to explore a new model for that, and I think that has been very promising. But I think thinking about that moving forward and exploring what role can national programs play, what role can Future Earth play in creating that, I think would be helpful. So again, remember I was thinking we were going to all be in a very cozy room with a discussion, so I was putting out some questions for us to discuss, and we don't have to answer these now at all, but first just thinking about how many people are engaged in sort of what they would call co-production of knowledge in your research. The other question is sort of what is the role of the digital age in how is that influencing how you do research, how you access information, how you engage with others, and more importantly, as we're kicking off the Future Earth effort really at an early stage, what role can Future Earth play in helping promote and support the co-production of knowledge model of global research? So that's all I have. So I don't know if you have some brief questions or, yeah.
I have a question. I really like your presentation, but I have a reflection. I think that we have this isolation process whereby elites of different sorts, be artists, political elites, create their own groups, closed groups. So my question is, or my reflection is both. How can we address that? But because if you see, for instance, people in Manhattan are more related to people in Las Lomas in Mexico City than they are to Queens or other parts in New York, and the same can be said about populations in Mexico City that are, I mean, you have these different groups that do not talk to each other. Yeah. And my thing is, this happens with many communities, not only with scientists. And so my question is, how do we address this, which is rather a cross-cutting process that affects many communities, not only scientists?
Yeah, no, Absolutely. And one of the reasons I wanted to show the sort of physical sorting in the U.S. of this change is that, it wasn't always true that everybody who lived next to each other thought just like each other. So I think that there is a transition in that, and I think that there has been evidence that shows that the online world is a more intersection that goes beyond what that cross-section of society. There's a broader intersection, but in the scientific community, there actually was a study that looked at there are Twitter tracks between scientists, and basically the message is, scientists tweet together, mainly, and so I will say there hasn't been a systematic question to ask, is that so much more than these others? But there have been studies that have shown that there is a greater diversity in some, there have been isolated studies that say greater diversity online than offline in terms of interaction. So, but the comparison, of course, hasn't been done. So I think your point is well taken. It's not unique to science, but the sort of dynamic that I was trying to set up in some ways is that it's almost an opportunity, or we could let it be, a real crisis. And how do we leverage that opportunity? But certainly.
Amy, both in your talk and Susie's talk there, it implied is the interest in finding incentives for scientists to co-produce, for co-production. And they're one of the most important incentives or disincentive to me has to do with how much it costs. And the time commitment can be a real cost. Some of the development of citizen science databases can actually be make it cheaper to develop your database. And I was wondering whether or not there are you or others have like made the case that is co-production cheaper, because that would be an incentive to draw people across the line. A lot of what I see in my daily work, where I'm trying to get science co-produced in order to have legitimate results that can be used for making regulatory decisions, I see a disincentive for scientists to get involved, and so we end up with information that lacks whether you call it that translation step or whatever. And I'm wondering if you've seen that compiled anywhere, that question about the actual cost as an incentive or disincentive.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, it's an interesting question for a couple of perspectives, because I see that one of the things that Future Earth is trying to do is to try to promote and strengthen co-production, and if it does become more expensive, what does it mean to do that, to promote it in the global research and enable that to happen? However, I would answer the question as my instinct is that the cost burden to the researcher is often time that doesn't necessarily exactly translate into money. I know time is money, but sometimes it's not. And so I would think that it's not as easily, if you said this research question and if you did the same research question with co-production of knowledge, it's hard to say that because you probably wouldn't do the same research question, and you probably wouldn't do the same research. So it's hard, I would think, to think about it on a cost basis what that would be, because it would be such a change. I think the transition to thinking about that in a new way is the inertia of that is certainly, there's certainly a cost to that. But I'm not sure you could do a straight analysis of the cost, but maybe I don't know if anybody else had you have thoughts?
The issue is the cost effectiveness, we do research that's not used.
Right. So Susie was saying that, it's the cost effectiveness if you're using research is not used, and that sort of gets to the point of what I was saying is like you would just ask a different question. So it's hard to compare it, and if your value is you want to solve this problem in this community, then even if it costs more to do it and you ask a different question, it was probably better. But if your interest in the research community is actually just to answer this question, which is a different question, then the researcher might say that this is the most cost-effective, right? So it's a perspective thing, and that's why I think that's a right. I think you're right. Probably some consideration like that is important, but I think it would be hard to do. Thank you.